think the first thing that came to mind for us in building this program, I think very sort of intuitively, was this idea of sort of working with non-actors, working with, you know, people that are sort of close to you in this way, and also kind of capturing, you know, them in sort of impoverished settings that I think for me kind of goes beyond the usual kind of fascination and kind of amounts to a sort of form of honesty. These films are constructed very, very differently. Obviously, your film is a documentary, Winston. It's a fiction, but for example, Winston, I know you work a lot with family, for example, which is built into the story, of course, but it's also, I think, reflected in how you cast a film. And Brian, Melanie, of course, you know, I think how you approach your subjects and how closely you kind of construct the documentary, but also sort of the fiction that may be within them, I think is really, really interesting. And so maybe to start, I would love to hear a bit about that sort of process for the both of you.
Yeah, well, you know, since I started making movies as a teenager and sort of just being in my hometown of New Waterford, it's, you know, it's not a place that really, you know, it doesn't have a film community, so it's, you know, they're not able to really nurture this pursuit in you, so you sort of make do with what you have, and luckily I didn't dream of making Star Wars or something like that, you know, and so I was always sort of interested in the story of the guy who's living next to the St. Michael's Church or something, or an anecdote I've heard from my aunt, or, you know, so it sort of started there for me. And I was always sort of, my grandfather actually, who's the patriarch of the family, you know, I grew up in a multi-generational home, and those are his home videos that you see on screen, so maybe that had some kind of unconscious influence on me. But, you know, it's really a punk spirit for me, the way somebody only knows 3 chords on the guitar and they, you know, just they'll start a band, and that's sort of how it started for me. I don't really know if that answered your question, but yeah, and then just sort of working with your friends or family that are around, and yeah, and making stories about your community and the people in it.
Mm-hmm. That spirit, of course, is through, and certainly felt that throughout yours and how you constructed it. And it didn't feel like schematic at all. It felt like very, very sort of intuitive, and the scenes themselves almost felt like songs on a record in a way. And I think that's sort of how we sometimes think structurally about our I guess nonfiction work, is that at least a fair amount of the process is creating moments and constructing scenes, and then figuring out how to connect them or sequence them in a way like the way you might sequence songs on an album, where you're feeling, you know, okay, we've had a couple of really hard ones, and now let's bring it down, and then okay, now it's about to get boring, let's bring it back up again, and, you know, so in a way, a part of how we put our movies together has that kind of a spirit. I think that Melanie and I both really like vivid, lived-in scenes, but then, of course, at some point, because of duration and trying to sort of hold attention, other kind of narrative responsibilities come in, or things where that can only take you so far, and so then we put on a different hat and think about how to make, you know, make it work on a more global sort of level.
Yeah. How did you meet Lloyd, and how did he come into your orbit in a sense?
Well, both Brian and I have always had a tremendous soft spot for people living on the fringes. Brian, when he was younger, worked in group homes with people with mental illness and various disabilities. And I, as an older teenager in my early 20s, spent quite a lot of time with people living on the streets, and would even sometimes invite them to come to my parents' house while my parents were out of town to shower and make them dinner. And I always knew that eventually I would want to make a film with people experiencing homelessness. We approached the NFB, this idea, and we thought we'd make a sort of panoramic of various people experiencing homelessness. We volunteered at a shelter for a year to meet people. Met a lot of people with interesting stories. At the 1 year mark, we met Lloyd, and as soon as we met him, we're like, oh no, the film absolutely needs to be about this character. We met him right before the pandemic hit in mid-February of 2020, and then like 10 days after we met him, my sister passed away unexpectedly. And Lloyd was the first person we saw when we came back to Montreal after she'd passed away. And he, in an unusual sort of a way, became a kind of guide for us during a very difficult time, because at that point we were dealing with the pandemic, we were dealing with our grief, and though he's not a shoulder to cry on, he's someone who has navigated very difficult terrain, and it almost sort of means nothing to him. The pandemic meant nothing to him. He's able to pivot and just live, and that's the sort of richness of his life, that he always makes things work, even though it seems like he's without, he's not without. So it's interesting when you mention the idea of poverty, because even though he doesn't have money, I've never thought of him as poor. And it's also really interesting that you mention the spiritual quality, because Brian and I have always thought that this is our most spiritual film.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you picked up on that as well.
There is something, I mean, I get to that too, because there is something, I think, not to make a bad pun with your previous work, but there is something where you try to get to the dream life of Lloyd and Winston as well. Like, I think, you know, there's something really striking in how you construct this sort of back and forth between the home videos and the sort of present tense of the film. But then there's this element of, you know, and a big source of the humor, which is this sort of element of almost kind of like a skewedness or sort of fantasy. Certainly with the Who's contraption, which I love. But I think it has to do with maybe this sort of, maybe a sort of intuitive way that you construct the story, and a sort of process, perhaps, that I mean, that I'd love to hear kind of about, because both films are so dreamy, right? They're so in their way, and how do you construct this? Yeah, how do you construct this dreaminess?
I was happy to hear some laughter. You know, I wasn't sure if it would read as funny at times, but it was definitely intentional. It's a comic tragedy in a lot of ways. But yeah, in terms of this dreamlike quality, I mean, I've always thought of the film as you know, a film about, quite simply, a lost love, or my version of a lost love story, and it's a thing where, like, for me, I wanted the form to reflect the way Molly and Sunshine would be remembering her trip home. So you have these dual perspectives, and so with that sort of subjective quality, I feel like that gives you a lot of freedom to sort of get strange and sort of go into more of a dreamlike, feverish quality that definitely is channeling what they're going through on that level, you know. And originally it was a traditional script, you know, playful. The structure was playful, but it was 80 pages. And the film is 82 minutes, so we really stuck with the structure a lot, like that was originally conceived. So the pool scene is in the same place in the script as where it is in the film. But it's kind of a thing where I wanted there to be spaces between the story facts that hopefully make you a little self-conscious as an audience, and you can kind of insert your own personal experiences into these spaces, you know. So I thought it made a lot more sense to me to approach the story that way, and sort of it gave me a lot of freedom to be expressive, you know.
And I would say, yeah, I mean, pushing more into the sort of oniric, dreamlike space feels to us very natural. It feels very much, in a way, it seems like cinema wants to be dream-like experience. It's the way when you're putting things together, sound and picture, it just seems to ask for that over and over again, at least for us. And you know, one of the things with this film is, at least in the early stages, one of the guiding principles was more like what we didn't want to do than what we did. I mean, the proposition of making a film with the idea of homelessness was something we were like, you know, keenly aware of the tropes and well-worn images and cliches and pity parties and, you know, all of the kinds of things that so at first it was more like, well, we're not going to do that, we're not going to do this, right? You know, but what are we going to, you know? And so at some point we started to go more into that sort of these departures into abstraction, which we felt were in sympathy with Lloyd's hypersensitive way of processing the world, and also with our desire to be more subjective and to show our hand as makers at the same time. We never wanted to presume that we could get in the minds of someone with schizophrenia and then illustrate it. That was one of the other things we didn't want to do, but we did want to evoke the heightened awareness with which, and tactility with which he navigates his experiences, you know, on the margins of the city. And so, and I think in general, these departures, you know, it's like going into the footage and the archival material, these sort of departures into another time space, and then the return to a more grounded thing. It's a nice push-pull kind of an experience.
Yeah, this push-pull dynamic, I was so interested in that, especially with the Beau character, you know, who's he's somebody who he completes this trinity of misfits, you know, in this town. We have Beau, Sunshine, and Molly, and I feel like Beau is the most aggressive in sort of navigating this feeling of not quite fitting in with his community, and he's sort of elbowing his way into these relationships, and he has the hardest time suppressing who he really is, you know, and he's sort of he has to complete a thought no matter what, and it turned into this expression of having him go into these spaces and sort of mess things up in this way that he's almost commenting on the story, in a sense the way we're maybe thinking about it as we're watching it. So there's a whole subjective quality to that, and I feel like, to go back to the home videos, actually, I don't know if you guys noticed, but that is my uncle in the later period, and in the home videos with his girlfriend at the end as the credits are rolling. And when Sunshine is sitting at the kitchen table and across from his uncle, that is sort of that is the present day version of my uncle. So yeah, it's a thing where back to the lost love idea, I had the most heaviest sort of scary first impression of lost love or heartbreak as a kid, and it involved my Uncle Wayne, and you see this evidence of this relationship unfolding and it was a situation where he went into a bathroom and he never really quite came out the same, you know, because he's also schizophrenic, which is when I heard about this film, and it was paired together, and I did some research. I thought, wow, this is so fitting, you know, and he's, the thing is it was dormant in him for so long, and then the shock of the breakup erupted the schizophrenia, and there was kind of this really tragic, romantic sort of truth to that, and it's evidenced in the home videos, and you see this unfolding. My grandfather had such a unique way that I later appreciated of making home videos. He would just hang on people and until just linger until, you know, this image we present of ourselves when we know a camera is rolling, it starts to drop, and then a narrative starts unfolding. And I would see this in his home videos, and I appreciated it when I was older, and I just thought they were so beautiful, and I had to work it into the film, and it was such a kind of a guiding light, you know.
You're both really hands-on with the cinematography of the films, if I'm not mistaken, Winston. Did you shoot this one, or was it I think you shot this one, no?
I had a DP for principal photography, and there are sections, especially near the end, anything with my Uncle Wayne at the table with sunshine. I'm shooting that, so that it's sort of just little bits throughout the film. And, you know, I gathered that material throughout the pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
and it didn't scare me to gather material this way, because it's how I've always made films, and to go out with my cousin recording sound and just sort of get what I needed was really just, you know, it was so familiar to me, and yeah, and that's what I'm used to doing, is shooting all my own work. So
I asked because there's this closeness that I'm really interested in how you both kind of frame people, but also this sort of askewness to that, right? There's this attention to framing, which is kind of never the frame one would expect necessarily, I think. It's sort of, I look at it as a sort of photographer's eye in the midst of a narrative kind of film, and I love that tension, and I'd be curious to hear you talk about just framing in this way, and because it does kind of create this dreaminess that we were talking about, in this sort of sense of unease, perhaps, or kind of being a bit too close, maybe. And from that, I also wonder, like, how do you construct these spaces with your subjects or your actors, and is there a moment where you may be too close, or how do you balance it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because this idea of too close. Yeah, it's so I don't know. I'm very tempted to just get right up next to, very close to people. It's just something I've always gravitated towards. I don't have any grand reason why. It's just a curiosity.
Sorry, and I'll just interrupt here. One would think Brian gets extremely close with the camera. I mean, like, it can be here.
Yeah.
And one would think that the subject would be uncomfortable, but it's actually the opposite. The subjects actually enjoy, like it's a caress. They enjoy being kind of seen up close. So it's counterintuitive in a way.
And particularly with Lloyd, what you just really hoped for with someone, which I would say it's an absolute criteria, and which he met in spades, was he had an unbelievable ability to just see right through it. It didn't stop him. It wasn't halting for him. And you know, part of that is, as Melanie says, I'm used to doing, and it's an area I'm confident in. I can move in and put people at ease. But he also was just somehow able to completely just be himself in those moments in a way I've rarely seen before. And so the combination of somebody with such presence, such an extraordinary face, I mean, his physiognomy is just, I mean, he has a Lincoln-esque, I mean, we you know, one of the things that we spent a year kind of casting out of this shelter, and part of what we were looking for, we weren't so much looking for people's stories the way journalists would, and this is where our practice as filmmakers really, it's not documentary and journalism in a sense, but we were looking for someone kind of transcendent, someone who, if you were a painter, you might want to just paint over and over and over again under different lighting conditions in different scenarios. Somebody who could just exist out in the world, and that we would sort of feel was inexhaustible. And you know, we found that with Lloyd, and you know, Melanie and I come from a background as stills photographers. That's what we were doing before we started making movies, and so we didn't go to traditional film school. So I think when we frame things or when we put images together, yeah, we're doing it out of just what feels right to us, and maybe that's where some of that askewness comes from.
From IONCINEMA.com. If you want to support us, subscribe below. For more reviews, interviews, film festival coverage from Sundance, Cannes, Toronto, you want to check out these guys on this side.